We're in St. Petersburg at the height of the Cold War, and a deeply embedded CIA agent has just been rumbled. He runs as fast as he can as a pair of Soviet soldiers wielding Kalashnikovs follow him, trying to get a bead. If they catch him, he might end up filled with more bullets than a firing range. But he's got an ace up his sleeve, something that nobody would expect. The agent runs around a sharp corner and flees into an alley, drawing on his adrenaline stores to put more distance between himself and the soldiers. He weaves from narrow street to narrow street, always staying just one step ahead of his pursuers, until they find him. He's standing deathly still, perhaps luring them in to strike. The soldiers don't want to take the chance. One raises his weapon and fires a shot through the agent's leg. There's no scream, no blood, just a strange hissing noise as the agent seems to deflate before their very eyes. Baffled by what they're seeing, they step forward, only to see that what they thought was their target was actually a flimsy load of plastic spilling out of a pocket-sized box. Is that a blow-up doll? We know you can't get enough of the absurd, exciting, and sometimes downright evil antics of the Central Intelligence Agency. For the several decades since their humble beginnings as the Office of Strategic Services, gathering intelligence behind enemy lines during the Second World War, the CIA has become a monolithic force, conducting questionable activities across the world, with operations ranging from controversial to outright illegal. While they might claim to only act within the Constitution and laws of the United States, as well as adhering to international treaties, things like legality, morality, and general human decency are considered to be entirely optional for the CIA, from torturing detainees at off-the-book black sites, planning and attempting assassinations, and backing paramilitary forces to topple governments that the U.S. feels threatened by. The CIA is no stranger to getting a whole host of human rights violations under their belts. Don't believe us? Well, at the risk of landing ourselves on an agency watch list, here are just 10 of the most insane covert CIA operations we were able to find. Most of their secrets are buried from the public, so bear in mind, these are the things they're comfortable with people knowing about. Let's start with one that's practically become an open secret: black sites. The public has known about the existence of these CIA-run prisons for nearly 2 decades, ever since President George W. Bush acknowledged them in a speech. But it's almost a certainty that these sites existed for a good while before he told us about them, most likely being established around 2001, shortly after 9/11, to capture suspected terrorists. To call these prisons is a misnomer, since they weren't just places where people were detained, but also tortured. Enhanced interrogation is the euphemistic name for a program that the Bush administration approved following the September 11th attacks, one that permitted operatives of the CIA to violate the Geneva Convention and torture the suspects they detained at the black sites. So you must be thinking, how could they get away with something like that? Surely they'd never be allowed to do something like that in America. Well, loving your optimism here, champ, but the CIA isn't authorized to conduct operations on United States soil, so there's your answer. That's how they got away with it. There were black sites confirmed to have existed in countries like Afghanistan, Lithuania, Morocco, Romania, Thailand, and Poland, where the CIA was free to use objectionably cruel methods of enhanced interrogation. These included beating suspects, waterboarding, threatening the families of those who had been detained, subjecting them to extended periods of sleep deprivation, and even torment of a far more unpleasant and private nature. On one black site, codenamed Salt Pit or Cobalt, but also known as the Dark Prison by those held there, prisoners were blasted with loud music while left in total darkness. In the same location, one detainee died of hypothermia after being left naked and chained to a concrete floor for days. And if you thought the torture was the worst of it, then brace yourself. Not only were a number of the detainees at those black sites completely innocent, but the CIA barely received any actionable intelligence from all this. Most prisoners gave fabricated stories just to make the torture stop for a moment, and a Senate committee even ended up ruling that enhanced interrogation methods were ineffective. What's darker, torturing innocent people at black sites or working directly with Nazis? Tough call, right? But the boys at Langley aren't here to split hairs over which is worse. They're asking, why not both? By now you're probably familiar with Operation Paperclip, a U.S. intelligence program that relocated over 1,000 former Nazi scientists and technicians to the United States. After all, their knowledge would help develop technological advancements for military and industrial purposes, and even partly help put mankind on the moon. All it took was looking the other way about what the scientific expertise might have been used for during World War II. But it may surprise you to learn that Operation Paperclip wasn't the only post-war operation that saw the CIA or their precursor, the Office of Strategic Services, turning to Nazis for help. The ominously codenamed Operation Bloodstone involved the agency tracking down Nazis and their collaborators living in hiding in the wake of the Second World War, not to make them stand trial, but to enlist them as operatives. Yeah, that's right. Many of those who were hired as part of Operation Bloodstone had been former Nazi intelligence agents, many of whom were guilty of committing war crimes. After all, the CIA indulges in violating human rights all the time. Naturally, they'd look to hire operatives with relevant work experience. Proposed by the U.S. State Department and approved in 1948 by a committee consisting of consultants from the United States Army, Navy, and Air Force. Yes, someone approved this idea. Bloodstone's purpose was to seek out any former Nazis living in areas that were controlled or influenced by the Soviet Union. You see, right around the end of the Second World War, the U.S. started getting really paranoid about the spread of communism in other countries. Lucky for the CIA, this meant that they were ideologically aligned with Nazi agents who were hiding out in countries within the Soviet Union, Latin America, and Canada, and who also happened to share the U.S.'s intense dislike for communism. In the early stages of Operation Bloodstone, the CIA was able to identify several anti-communist elements in countries both within and outside of the Soviet Union's orbit. They were deemed to be potentially valuable assets to the agency, thanks to their ability to counter pro-Soviet propaganda. Through Bloodstone, the CIA sought to provide these individuals with funding to make them a more coordinated international network. The operation was expanded not long after approval, with the CIA then permitted to mobilize these friendly forces, pretty sure the Nazis are notoriously unfriendly, into taking covert actions within Soviet-controlled areas. These were said to include enacting psychological warfare, sabotage, as well as the rescue of any airmen from Allied forces held in Soviet countries. Some of these Nazis turned CIA stooges were even permitted to capture targets of value to the US and assassinate others. Remember only a few minutes ago when we pointed out that the CIA isn't authorized to conduct its operations domestically within the USA? That's what we in the entertainment biz call foreshadowing, because it turns out that nobody thought to tell Tricky Dick not to allow the CIA to spy on US citizens. Well, it's not like anyone at the CIA really objected, even if it's a direct violation of their own charter. Oops. Let's talk about the very aptly named Operation Chaos. During Richard Nixon's run as president, there was widespread disapproval of the Vietnam War among the American public, so much so that over 250,000 people in the US alone were involved in anti-war demonstrations. Nixon was not happy about that and quickly came to resent the anti-war movement, not only because people objecting to the conflict helped lower the morale of US troops fighting overseas, but also because he had suspicions that there might have been other forces behind it. Specifically, wait for the dramatic organ, communists. Another bit of foreshadowing from earlier is that by the late 40s the US was starting to make its fear of communism known and trying to stop its spread in other countries covertly. Then by the late 60s, paranoia toward communism was fully in vogue. It was practically a national pastime. And so, suspecting that foreign powers might be backing the anti-war movement in the US, Nixon ordered the CIA to investigate the possibility of communist support for the demonstrations against the Vietnam War. As a result, Operation Chaos was born, and the part of the CIA's charter mandating that they focus their counterintelligence efforts on overseas targets was conveniently ignored. The CIA agents were sent to infiltrate universities across America, targeting various civil rights and anti-war groups, learning the culture and even the different slang used by the groups they targeted. These agents gathered the names of more than 300,000 American citizens and organizations that were linked to the movement, with more detailed files being produced on over 7,000 people. Details like their place of birth, complete lists of their family members, and their affiliations with different organizations were contained within 201 files. And again, this is a healthy reminder that the CIA charter usually prevents them from doing this because of a principle from the US Constitution entitling American citizens to a high degree of privacy. Any links to foreign communist influence in the anti-war movement were found to be tenuous at best. The CIA reported back to Nixon in 1969, telling him that they couldn't see much in the way of communist funding or training, nor did there seem to be any outside direction or control over the civil unrest groups that the agency had targeted. It turns out people had their own reasons for not supporting the Vietnam War that didn't require the oh-so-terrifying lure of communism. Many of those investigated by the CIA as part of chaos were students, and the then director of the agency, Richard Helms, even acknowledged this in a cover letter to Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. He pointed out that spying on American students wasn't exactly in the CIA's purview, and should anyone learn of Operation Chaos's existence, it would prove most embarrassing for all concerned. Again, oops. Jumping from one type of chaos to another, let's keep our focus on the Cold War era and some of the outright baffling espionage tactics used by the CIA against their Russian rivals, the KGB. In the late 70s, CIA operatives embedded within Moscow needed a way to keep nosy KGB counterspies off their tails, or at least something to distract them long enough for those undercover CIA agents to slip away unnoticed. Still, you'd think even the CIA wouldn't come up with an idea as baffling as, well, using, an inflatable friend. Okay, while many retellings of this weird Russian rubber doll ruse will describe the inflatables in question in a certain way, they were intended to be a lot closer to Otto the Autopilot from Airplane. They were referred to as the jib, or jack-in-the-box, and the principle for how they'd be developed went something like this. Say you're a CIA operative with no qualms about spying on another country, and you're in Moscow and you're on your way to a secret meeting. Your contact within the Kremlin's about to cough up some yummy intel on how terrifying and evil communism is. But what's that in the rearview mirror? A suspicious unmarked car. Probably means some KGB agents have caught on to what you're up to, but don't worry, stowed under your seat you've got a secret weapon. And it's not a silenced handgun, it's jib. Usually kept contained in an inconspicuous package in your car. Once you've created enough of a gap between you and your new KGB pals on your tail, you'd pull up to a corner and quickly slip out before they noticed. By the time they caught up to the car, you'd be long gone, but your inflatable fellow agent would have taken your place in the car and given his last breath for liberty. You see, the jibs were exactly what you'd think. They were modified rubber dolls dressed up with male likenesses, since almost all CIA agents were men during this decade. These dolls were then rigged to deploy by inflating out of their container in order to act as a decoy, essentially using a primitive form of the same technology that we now use for airbags. This wasn't the only way the CIA used rubber to get one over on Russia either, as another plan they had involved airdropping shipments of US-brand contraceptives into the USSR, but with a demoralizing twist for the Russian troops. These extra large-sized sheaths would be incorrectly labeled as medium. Talk about a measuring contest. This plan never saw the light of day, but the jibs certainly did, thanks in part to the work of two Hollywood costume specialists enlisted to help the CIA by the head of their disguise department, Walter McIntosh. Les Smith and John Chambers loaned their expertise to the agency on more than one occasion. Famously, thanks to the 2012 hit Argo, Chambers had helped create a fake sci-fi movie called Lord of Light to help the CIA rescue 6 Americans during the Iranian hostage crisis. CIA agents pretended to be a part of a production crew for a fake movie, using a script and even concept art created by comic legend Jack Kirby to convince Iranian officials. Also, they could sneak U.S. hostages out of the country. But that wouldn't be the only time the Central Intelligence Agency tried their hand at a little bit of movie magic. However, their next foray into filmmaking was a little bit more risque. Unknowingly borrowing plot beats from the underrated 2016 action comedy The Nice Guys, the CIA once made an adult film. Digging information about what powerful people get up to privately behind closed doors has a long history of being the go-to tactic for anyone looking to blackmail or discredit them. And sure enough, the CIA isn't above that either. However, they then took it a step further and actually had a specialty tape commissioned and allegedly filmed in Hollywood of all places. Indonesia's first elected official was President Sukarno, the leader of the independence movement against Dutch colonialism, and he entered office in 1945 as a national hero with overwhelming public support from everyone, it turned out, except the CIA. Sukarno had a reputation for being genuinely passionate about Indonesia, the rights of its citizens, and particularly of women, eventually causing him to align himself closely with communist allies during the Cold War. While not a communist himself, he shared some of the ideologies of the Soviet Union and added to the fact that Indonesia was home to the largest communist party outside the USSR. It all combined to make President Sukarno unpopular with a certain powerful U.S. intelligence agency. You see, those in charge of U.S. foreign policy at the time were big believers in the domino theory, that if communist revolutions happened in one country, then they would spread to their neighbors. So in order to try to curb this and sever Indonesia's ties with the Soviet Union and China, the CIA attempted to oust President Sukarno. After wasting $1 million trying to sway Indonesia's 1955 elections, their usual method of training local rebels to launch paramilitary campaigns against the leader of another country just wasn't quite working out. But reports had been circulating that President Sukarno had allegedly had an affair with a flight attendant who may have, as it turned out, been a KGB spy, which potentially now meant that the Soviets had leverage against him. However, the CIA saw this as an opportunity to undermine Sukarno's reputation as Indonesia's national hero by painting him as a sleazy, promiscuous figure. Merely spreading rumors about Sukarno wasn't going to cut it, though. As it turned out, the KGB had already tried to blackmail him by having a group of women posing as flight attendants sent to a hotel room he was staying at for some group activities that they even allegedly filmed. But this did nothing to damage the reputation of Sukarno, who had always openly supported and practiced polygamy. When the CIA-backed rebel forces in Indonesia proved themselves to be ineffective at toppling the Indonesian government, the agency turned to some spicier methods. Casting a body double wearing a lifelike mask of Sukarno's likeness, the CIA had an illicit tape made, only to then run into trouble actually circulating the explicit images before the days of the internet. The CIA had ultimately bankrolled a jazz movie for nothing, as they later worked with the British intelligence agency MI6 to facilitate a coup that replaced Sukarno and his government with a pro-Western dictator, who then embarked on a campaign of mass murder, having real and suspected communists executed. Great job, CIA. Next up is Operation Midnight Climax. And we know what you're thinking. Yes, that would have been the perfect name for the operation we were just talking about. In actuality, it was a sub-project of the now infamous Project MKUltra that, among other things, involved experimenting with LSD and attempts to research the possibility of developing mind control. Yes, this was a real thing, and regardless of what Stranger Things might tell you, these experiments were horrific. Operation Midnight Climax came about when the CIA decided to look into the potential use cases for a combination of drugs and intimate encounters to interrogate potential suspects. And much like Operation Chaos, this was yet another covert CIA operation that took place right here in America, San Francisco to be exact. The CIA recruited local escorts to pick up completely unassuming men at bars and bring them back to a brothel that the agency had turned into its very own testing lab. Two-way mirrors were everywhere so that agents could watch and film the reactions of their unwitting and non-consenting test subjects. At a price of $100 each to the ladies that brought them in, each of these men was dosed with lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD, without their knowledge. This was done to distort their senses and impair their normal sense of judgment, while the CIA agents in the next room monitored how they reacted to the drugs. Once they were, quote, alone and unaware of the CIA's prying eyes, these men were then engaged in conversations by the women who had brought them in. Their goal was to see if combining the use of LSD with some company for the night could trick these men into divulging any sensitive information. All their conversations were being monitored through listening devices strategically hidden around each of the bordello's rooms, with some of the men being given other psychotropics as well for the CIA to determine which chemicals would be better suited for interrogation. Obviously, giving someone a dangerous and powerful hallucinogen, especially if they're unaware they're being given it, is massively irresponsible. Even more so since LSD can induce symptoms that closely resemble psychosis, the men being used for these experiments were never told what had been done to them and were given no information on what the potential side effects of taking LSD could be. It was simply administered so the CIA could sit back and watch what happened. Operation Midnight Climax even got a secondary branch up and running in a similar bordello in Greenwich Village, New York. Perhaps the worst part of the whole operation is that these inhumane experiments were allowed to continue for an entire decade, from 1953 to 1963. Around the same time that Operation Midnight Climax was getting off the ground, another of the CIA's insane schemes was unfolding over in Europe, their first major covert action of the Cold War. In 1954, there was growing anxiety surrounding the potential for a large-scale nuclear conflict, which had only gotten worse since the culmination of the Second World War. With two of the largest superpowers on the planet, the USA and the USSR both possessing nuclear weapons, and the latter doing a worrying amount of testing with those weapons, things were understandably tense. How did the CIA plan to solve it? Well, they decided to dig a big hole. Working hand in hand with Britain's equally shady intelligence agency MI6, who are alleged to have conducted their own fair share of overseas human rights abuses too, the Central Intelligence Agency launched Operation Gold in 1954. Unlike the name suggests, this mission was not about digging for gold, but a different kind of buried treasure, information. You see, a lot of the espionage conducted by Western countries against the East and vice versa was done through Berlin. As you may already know, in the wake of World War II, the city was partitioned into separate blocks, controlled by the Allied nations that had won the war. So the CIA planned to establish a way to tap into the communication lines running out of the Soviet Union and into other parts of Eastern Europe through Berlin's Eastern Bloc, all the way into Germany's neighboring France, with the help of a tunnel underneath Berlin. The CIA's joint effort with MI6 in this venture wasn't just because the US and UK had a shared interest in monitoring Soviet communications, but because the Brits had managed to pull off something similar a few years earlier. In 1948, MI6's Operation Silver, get it? It's less valuable than gold? Had sought to tap Austrian phone lines that linked the USSR military headquarters in Moscow to Austria's capital city of Vienna. Much like Berlin, Vienna was a hotbed of espionage operations and had similarly been divided into 4 militarized zones controlled by Britain, the US, France, and the Soviets. By building in the city and creating a fake business to act as cover, MI6 agents could dig a 70-foot-long tunnel to the telephone lines used by the Soviets. Not to be outdone, the CIA saw this and they wanted in, so they worked alongside British intelligence to dig a new tunnel beneath Berlin into parts of Germany that were now considered to be Soviet territory. Since the cables that ran deep beneath the city couldn't be monitored from listening posts above ground, digging down to where they were and tapping them directly avoided the risk of Soviets detecting that their calls were being listened in on. So, working under the cover story that the US was building an Air Force radar site and a warehouse in their part of Berlin, the CIA got to digging. While the Soviets weren't exactly content to ignore the US's activities in Berlin, they seemed to believe that they were just building another military installation. That is, until the CIA decided to brief the British on what they were doing, which proved to be a horrendous mistake. One of the MI6 intelligence officers briefed about Operation Gold turned out to be a Soviet mole and a double agent named George Blake. He took detailed notes and passed them on to his USSR contacts, ultimately making the Soviets aware of Operation Gold almost immediately. Blake would be discovered nearly a decade later in 1961 and imprisoned, although he successfully escaped to Moscow and lived as a Soviet hero until he died in 2020. Jumping back to the Vietnam War and the CIA's, wait, am I reading this right? Their Phoenix program? Well, admittedly, as cool as it would be to see a mythical flaming bird being unleashed, as with everything the CIA gets up to, the Phoenix Project was deeply unethical and considered to be one of the most controversial aspects of the US war in Vietnam. During the war, the South Vietnamese government had been making an organized effort to root out members of the Viet Cong, the communist-backed insurgent fighters in the north. They launched a counterinsurgency campaign against the Viet Cong. This program was named Phuong Hoang, referencing a bird from traditional Vietnamese and Chinese culture, often associated with royalty and power. So when the CIA also got involved with these counterinsurgency efforts, they referred to their operations under the closest analog in more Western recognized mythology, the Phoenix. As part of the Phoenix programs, the Central Intelligence Agency used paramilitary teams to seek out and eliminate communist operatives who were stationed undercover in villages throughout South Vietnam. The reason for Phoenix's controversy was primarily due to the CIA's routine of these teams carrying out assassinations, as well as, you guessed it, that CIA classic, torture. Oh, and this was all while American officials denied any involvement in these activities in Vietnam. You see, given that the paramilitary teams, including soldiers, analysts, and of course interrogators, working under the CIA's orders were Vietnamese, it allowed the US a degree of plausible deniability. The mission statement of the Phoenix program was to destroy the Viet Cong outright, to attack their entire infrastructure by any means necessary, including not just targeted killings, but acts of terrorism. Part of the premise behind the program was the idea that the Viet Cong's influence had only spread in North Vietnam thanks to support from local civilians who weren't necessarily joining up to fight, but who had potentially allowed the Viet Cong to operate in regional areas or even helped them coordinate their insurgency efforts. So, working under the assumption that many of these civilian non-combatants were secretly Viet Cong members, the Phoenix program neutralized 81,740 people. Over 26,000 of those people were killed, with the remainder either surrendering to Phoenix program operatives or being captured. The very nature of the program was widely criticized as being a civilian assassination program, given the number of very likely neutral, innocent people killed, either under the suspicion of Viet Cong involvement or simply to leave the VC with fewer people to influence. That it certainly did, suppressing the Viet Cong's revolutionary insurgent activities. When the details of the Phoenix program were released to the public, the CIA faced widespread criticism and was forced to shut it down. However, that's not to say the Phoenix or its method stopped there, as a similar program, Plan F6, continued under the government of South Vietnam. While it's easy to focus on the brutality and the inhumanity of methods like torture or the insidious puppeteering of foreign forces to do the US's dirty work, one of the CIA's most frightening weapons is its control over information. What the public is allowed to know about and what remains withheld can massively influence people's opinions. That's essentially how propaganda functions. In addition to controlling access to publicly available information, art and literature have long had incredible power to influence people's perspectives. Case in point, during the 50s, the CIA attempted to redistribute a classic Russian novel around the world as a weapon, a piece of propaganda to turn global opinions against the Soviet Union and against communism as a whole. Written by Boris Pasternak, Dr. Zhivago follows its titular fictional character, a physician and a poet, through the historical events of the Russian Revolution of 1905 and the Second World War. So why was this Russian book originally first published in Italy? Well, Pasternak belonged to an older societal class within his home of Moscow, a class that had fallen out of public favor since the country's communist revolution. Given that because of his background, Pasternak's book conveyed his own very critical stance against the October Revolution, the USSR refused to allow Dr. Zhivago to be published in Russia. It was one of the numerous books banned or censored for containing anti-revolutionary sentiments. Had the manuscript not been smuggled to a publisher in Milan by an Italian literary scout living in Moscow, it likely never would have seen the light of day. Upon publication, Dr. Zhivago earned Pasternak the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1958, which enraged the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, urging the Kremlin and the Italian Communist Party to suppress the book's publication. Now, a book that draws the ire of the Soviet Union is a book that the CIA would be highly interested in reading themselves. So much so that when a British intelligence officer sent the agency 2 rolls of film containing photos of the book's pages, the CIA saw potential for using Dr. Zhivago for their own ends. Upon reading the book, they agreed with the Soviet Union's assessment that Pasternak had created an anti-revolutionary piece. But to the CIA, it could be a valuable tool as a piece of propaganda. So they planned to have Dr. Zhivago republished, this time in Russian, and then disseminated among Soviet citizens to sway their opinions against the Communist Party. The CIA was given the go-ahead to exploit Pasternak's novel as long as it was made clear that the US government had, quote, no hand in the process. Of course, that just meant that the US didn't want it to be too obvious that they were involved. By seeking out the help of Dutch intelligence and publishers, as well as diplomats from the Vatican, the CIA was able to distribute around 1,000 Russian copies of Dr. Zhivago to Soviet visitors attending the 1958 World's Fair in Brussels. By July of the following year, at least 9,000 pocket-sized editions of the book had been printed at the CIA headquarters. They were among the 10 million copies of anti-communist books and magazines that the CIA was able to disseminate in the Soviet Union over the course of the Cold War. Attempting to sway the opinion of adults through propaganda is one thing, but trying to specifically influence children with a targeted fear campaign is arguably even more sinister. This brings us to possibly the most insane and notorious of covert CIA operations we've talked about today, a project known only by the codename Devil Eyes. Between 2005 and 2006, the Central Intelligence Agency was involved in a secretive psychological warfare program that sought to terrify young children by distributing action figures of Osama bin Laden. Yeah, you heard that right, bin Laden action figures. Naturally, during the mid-2000s, the US war on terror was still raging in direct response to 9/11, and bin Laden, the founder of the militant Islamist terrorist organization, had been identified as the mastermind behind the attack on the World Trade Center. Within weeks of the attacks taking place, the United States military had already responded with strikes against militants associated with al-Qaeda and fellow terrorist organization, the Taliban, invading the country of Afghanistan and killing or capturing thousands of al-Qaeda supporters. This drove their leadership, including bin Laden, into hiding. However, rather than weakening al-Qaeda, the U.S. invasion had encouraged them to evolve, conducting counterattacks against the American military through smaller cells and other grassroots independent groups that formed in support of al-Qaeda and in opposition to the U.S. So, the CIA came up with a strange strategy to scare the children of Afghanistan and Pakistan, as well as their parents, out of accepting the anti-American messaging of al-Qaeda and bin Laden by making them terrified that he was a demon. The agency enlisted the help of Donald Levine, a former executive from Hasbro, who had been considered the father of the G.I. Joe, for his role in helping launch the massively popular toy line, one that glorified the various branches of the U.S. military to children. Guess the CIA figured he'd had some relevant work experience for what they had planned too. The agency had Levine design a doll, standing at about 12 inches and made to resemble Osama bin Laden's likeness. 3 prototypes were made and 2 even resurfaced in 2014 and 2015, selling at auction for nearly $12,000 and over $6,000 respectively. The plan was that the figure's face would be painted with a material that would peel away when heated to reveal a more frightening one underneath. This demon-faced bin Laden had red skin, black facial markings, and piercing green eyes, hence the project's Devil Eyes codename. Donald Levine had business contacts in China who would assist with the manufacture and distribution of the demonic dolls to Afghan and Pakistani children to scare them and their families and turn public opinion against bin Laden and al-Qaeda. While the CIA acknowledged the existence of the Devil Eyes program in 2014, it's unknown how many were made beyond the 3 prototypes. The remaining one is said to still be in possession of the CIA. However, there have long been rumors that hundreds of the terrorist toys were manufactured and even shipped to Karachi, Pakistan in 2006. Now check out 50 insane declassified CIA secrets you aren't supposed to know, or watch this video instead.